Thank you, and thank you for the organisers for giving me the opportunity to present this paper. In 1945, it's quite well known that out of a pre-war community of 3.3 million Jews, only 300,000 remained alive. However, what is also known, but is often not really dealt with in any way that I can understand, is that this tiny remnant is made up not mostly of what are traditionally called survivors of concentration camps, those who joined local partisan groups, or those who managed to remain in hiding disguised, but it's actually 3/4 of this 300,000, about 250,000 possibly, were actually alive at the end of the war because they spent most of it not under Nazi control but under Soviet control. Now everybody knows this, yet at the same time this whole group of people seems to have disappeared off the historical map, as far as I can tell, apart from people who are specialists in the field. And my research was trying to recover why this had happened and to see what we could understand about the experiences of, let's face it, 250,000 surviving Jews, which make up a very large proportion of the surviving Jews of Europe. Yet their story seems to have been marginalised. I'll give you a brief anecdote to illustrate what I'm saying. Recently I was at a social event and I was introduced to a woman, and the person who I knew, our mutual friend, said, "Oh, John's doing a study of Polish Jews in the Soviet Union." Immediately the woman who'd just been introduced to me said, "Oh, my best friend's mother left Warsaw at the beginning of the war and came back 5 years later sitting on the top of a Russian tank." Okay, an interesting story. But what happened in between? There's 6 years in between about which we know nothing. How come a Jewish woman from Warsaw ends up leaving Warsaw in 1939 and coming back on top of a Russian tank in 1945? Well, people here probably can figure that out. But the average person, the average Jewish person of my generation and later generations, there's this huge hole in the historical narrative. And that's the hole that I tried to fill. So this throwaway sentence, for me, just got rid of all the detail and explanation and significance of everything that happened in between those two events. So out of this, two central research questions occurred to me. If you're an academic and you see a void, you want to fill it, so that's what I tried to do. Why were these very different wartime narratives, the experiences of 250,000 Polish Jews alive in 1945, virtually absent from the research and writing on the Holocaust? Not to mention, when you start thinking about it, popular films, documentaries, artistic, literary discussions, they just don't seem to be there. Why were they marginalised? Why don't they appear in Jewish Holocaust Museum displays? When we were upstairs this morning, I noticed on one display, I know this isn't strictly a Holocaust museum, it's a Ghetto Fighters Museum, but there was a little panel that said, September the 1st, 1939, Germans attack Warsaw. 8 days later, Warsaw falls, and then afterwards it said, many thousands escaped to the east. And then it goes on to other stories. So the people who escaped to the east just sort of vanish into some kind of mysterious void. Second, given that the people whose stories I was most interested in were either no longer alive or getting well on in years, to try to start a research project wouldn't have yielded me too many respondents. There are some, of course, still alive. I was interested in what was publicly available already about their experiences. So if I start with the second question, what sources are there for understanding these stories? Well, there are clearly academic articles. It's not like it's been totally ignored by academics. The first overview was that I could find in English particularly was in 1953. And in 1959 there was a very important article from Yad Vashem by Akko, the historian there. And he made a point then in 1959 that this story should not remain untold, and he was urging young historians to take an interest in this topic and to do something. And he even added for them, in case they wanted to pursue it, I think something like a 20-page questionnaire with about 12 sections in it and about 150 questions that they could ask if they wanted to find out more about it. I think some of the people who did the Shoah interviews should have had that questionnaire in front of them when they were doing the interviews, and they would have done a much better job in uncovering a lot of things that still aren't really clear. The second source, of course, is published memoirs, which start to emerge in Yiddish very soon after the war. And 20 or 30 years later, you're starting to get another stream of memoirs by people older and who are now asked. There's a growing impetus for all Holocaust survivors to tell their stories, and they get local publishers or personal publishers and publish their stories for their children or their community. And very quickly I was able to locate about 15 published memoirs in English from Polish Jews who had been in the Soviet Union during the war. And I used those to write a very long article on it. But the third and largely untapped source, and why I'm at this conference, of course, is the personal testimony. Now, interestingly enough, originally, and the point I've been making all along, is that this history has been marginalised, and many of the people, as I'll discuss later, who had this background didn't actually perceive themselves as survivors. The term survivors, they didn't take upon themselves, and it was not put upon them by others. So, in a sense, it was interesting when I started to look at, for example, the Shoah Foundation, and there's another archive in Melbourne, in Australia, where I come from, which was separately collected about 1,000 video interviews since the 1980s. There seemed to be some representatives of this group in both of those archives, which I was quite grateful to, because I had at first thought that they'd been excluded. So, overall, of those two sources which I started to look at, there were 190 video testimonies of people who had given their testimony in Australia alone. If you looked at the worldwide Shoah Foundation archive, there are about 12,000 Polish Jews in that archive, and out of that, 400 out of the 12,000 were in the Soviet Union. Now, if you go back to what I said at the beginning, 75 or 80% of those who survived were in the Soviet Union. There's a huge imbalance, but there's still 400 people, and 400 people is a very useful sample if you want to do any research. So I'm just beginning really to look at this testimony material as an addition to both the academic sources, and people are still writing academic articles about various aspects of this, and people have started using, I'm not the only person to discover these testimonies, of course, people are using them as well. And I've only tried to work my way through this 190 relevant testimonies for me that are collected in Australia, because I've had to limit myself somehow. Following on what was said this morning, I think more testimonies is better than less testimonies from the point of view of this kind of experience where there's so little known and where there's so many people who experienced it, and also, as I want to point out, where there's such a huge range of experiences. If you're talking about 250,000 people in a place like the Soviet Union, they went all over the place, they had different kinds of experiences. You could put them into some kind of categories, but there's still a lot of material until you get to the point that you were talking about, where you start getting the same material again, and you know that you've had enough. I've looked at 30 of them, and certainly each one is different from the other, and each one adds a little different twist or a little different aspect to the experience, and you start to see all the different trajectories and different pathways that these people took. Now, I know this is very different from the usual Holocaust narrative. There's not a lot of horror, there's not a lot of bitter experience, even though there are tough times. But these stories are fascinating, and the ways that people adapted are fascinating. And when you think of all the things that they had to deal with, you know, the general story deals with people moving into eastern Poland, or the Russians coming into where they lived, the Russian army coming into where they lived in eastern Poland. So you've got two groups of people who are treated differently straight away. You've got those who came from western and central Poland. You've got them having to escape, to cross borders, to get into the Russian zone, cross rivers, get people smugglers to get them in, have to negotiate, find jobs, figure out whether they're going to stay there or go back. Then there's the question of whether they're going to take up citizenship in the Soviet Union comes up, when the Soviet authorities put pressure on refugees to take up citizenship, or they just declare the people in Eastern Europe Soviet citizens. Are they going to take jobs inside Soviet Russia, or are they going to go back to German-occupied Poland, which was a choice that they sort of had, or they thought they had? Then some of them get deported by the Soviet authorities. Then the Germans enter the war and they get released in an amnesty because now the Poles are the allies of the Germans. So then they're back to being Poles again. Then the Soviet government falls out with the Polish government in exile because of the Katyn massacre and all the other sorts of things. So then they're back to being Soviet citizens, according to the Soviets. By this time, they haven't got any idea who they are, many of them. Some of them are then already in the Soviet army. There's Polish armies being formed. I mean, I've got 20 minutes. This is a 20-hour story, right? So I'm not going to go any further, but what I'm saying is that all of these different pathways were there, and they're there in the testimonies. And to get at them all, the testimonies are absolutely invaluable. Okay, what I'd like to say about them, and I'm just reiterating it really, is that testimony material, and I'm just going to ignore all the stuff about accuracy and validity and all those sorts of things. The testimony material itself, cumulatively, just adds this enormous richness to an understanding of the everyday experiences. And following on Christopher Browning's point about collected memories, if you get a lot of them, you get a lot of material about things where there's absolutely no other documentary evidence. These people are in Siberia, they're in Soviet Central Asia. There's no one documenting these experiences apart from the official things about their names and what they're doing. All the other aspects of their life, how do they adapt to living in Muslim-dominated Soviet Central Asia? How do they get along with these people? How do they get along with other Poles? Because, of course, it wasn't just Jews who were moving into Western Poland that ended up in the Soviet Union. There were a lot of ethnic Poles as well, about twice the number of Jews. All the interactions between all the various groups, interactions with Russians, interactions with Russian Jews. All these sorts of things are there in the testimonies, in anecdotes, in stories, fascinating stories. All right, how much have I got here? 10 minutes? 5 minutes?
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Plus.
Okay, let me offer a few you want me to finish now? A few tentative observations then to conclude. What's obvious about testimonies that are gathered 40 years later is you're getting a very concentrated age cohort. Of the 30 interviewees I've looked at from the Shoah Foundation, when the war broke out, the youngest was 3 and the oldest was 21. And so if you add another 4 or 5 years or 6 years onto those, you see it's the experiences of people who were, by the time the war finishes, they were 10 to about in their mid to late 20s. So that's a very particular kind of experience, of course. And they weren't the only people who were in the Soviet Union. Because many of these testimonies were taken so late, a lot of people died. I mean, it's quite obvious that I come from this background. My parents were both dead long ago, so they never had a chance to give these stories. And you don't have to be Sigmund Freud to figure out why I'm doing this. I'm getting 190 testimonies because I couldn't get the 2 that really mattered. Anyway, be that as it may, if it benefits the cause, why not? So these are very much youthful recollections of youthful and young adults' experiences. And also, just in case the problem is, well, these people aren't survivors, in a technicality, it actually are survivors even in the most narrow definitions, because almost all of them lived under German occupation for some period of time. Sometimes only days, maybe a few months, maybe 6 months. Some of them even got into Eastern Poland quite late, just before the Germans invaded. So they also witnessed and sometimes even experienced the beginnings of Nazi brutalities against the Jews in Polish cities and towns. Well, there are many, I haven't got time to go into all the different trajectories and pathways that they took and the difference between those who were in Eastern Poland already and those who moved there as refugees. There was a lot of ironies to these experiences, which I might want to point out. One of the biggest ironies was the fact that most of the people who got deported to Siberia, who were refugees from Central and Western Poland, were given the option to become Soviet citizens or be returned to Germany, to German-occupied Poland. And they got deported because they said they wanted to return to German-occupied Poland rather than become Soviet citizens. And because of that, most of them stayed alive. People who were in Eastern Europe, a large group, tens of thousands of people, including Jews, were arrested by the authorities in the Sovietization period because they were landholders, because they were big businessmen or had a lot of money, wealthy, because they were in Zionist organisations or Bundist organisations, because they had official positions. They were generally taken to labour camps. Their prisoners were sent to places of exile. Those people tended to survive. The people who stayed, who did nothing against the Soviet authorities, usually died when the Germans invaded. So there were all these strange dark ironies about how people survived, not because they were smart or they made the right decisions, as some people say, or because they were clever, but because of a series of circumstances to which they really had no input or understanding that have influenced them because of the geopolitics of the situation, and out of which their only opportunity to manoeuvre was within the conditions that were set for them by external forces. Yet at the same time, for one reason or another, strangely and bizarrely, the Soviet Union saved more than 250,000 Polish Jews, not because they wanted to save them, but because of all these other circumstances. All right, I'll finish with just a couple of thoughts. Why, the first research question, why have these stories remained so little known and talked about? And I tried to identify three, because that's a good number in any research, three possible, what I would call inhibitory layers as to why these stories have remained submerged. I don't like the word silence because I don't believe there was any silence, but I believe there was a lot of factors that inhibited why these stories weren't widely known or understood. The first one has to do with the obvious one shared by all the survivors, which is the major components that people didn't talk about these things were feelings of grief, loss and guilt about those close to them who didn't survive. And people who were in the Soviet Union, when they came back to Poland, as most of them did, for other bizarre reasons that I haven't even had time to get into, found that most of their relatives had died. Most of the people they'd waved goodbye to when they left for Eastern Poland were no longer there. So the horror of that meant that they faced the same psychological factors about talking, not talking, and also rebuilding their lives, in places, because most of them left Poland fairly quickly afterwards. About 3/4 or more than 3/4 of those who returned from the Soviet Union left Poland in the 5 years following their return in 1946. So that wouldn't have helped them tell their stories. Most of them also went to countries like Israel, the United States, other English-speaking countries, had young children, generally weren't speaking the language when they went to those countries. Therefore, linguistically, the problems that we face about documents are also faced in families. How can you tell stories when you're not speaking a common language? How can you get across the complexities of this experience? A second layer, I'll be quick. A second layer of inhibition lies in the political dimension. In the immediate post-war years, the Soviet Union, Stalin, the international communist movement all represented polarising global political symbols. And Jews were just as divided about them as everyone else, perhaps even more so. How were the Polish Jews who'd been guests of the Soviet Union to respond to the country and the political system that for whatever reason saved them from likely extermination at the hands of the Nazis? A certain level of ambivalence was inevitable, and further complicated by the intensification of Cold War rhetoric in the West, and the campaign by World Jewry to allow Soviet Jews to emigrate. So it was generally wise not to praise the Soviet Union if you had positive times and feelings about it, which some of them did, particularly when they moved to the West. But the third layer, and one's probably the most contentious but probably the most fascinating, is this, what I'd crudely call the hierarchy of victimhood, that was both imposed and accepted by the Jews who returned to the Soviet Union. Many of the returnees were quickly made aware that in the general context of what had happened to others, their suffering had been relatively minor. These sentiments are echoed in numerous memoirs and testimonies. For example, much later when we heard about the concentration camps and what happened to people there, we called ourselves lucky. Despite the hard conditions, we still had a chance to survive. They had none. The author of one published memoir notes that he only succumbed to years of nagging by his two sons to write down his life story. They did not agree with my approach that I survived the war years in the comparative safety of the then Soviet Union, and that only people who were incarcerated in ghettos or concentration camps or who had been hiding from the Nazis should leave eyewitness accounts of those terrible years. And my suggestion is that this diminished status that was assigned to that experience has over many decades permeated into many of the debates around Holocaust memory and appropriate commemoration. It was in place very soon after the war, with concentration camp survival at the top and Soviet experience at the bottom. And it's only because these archives in recent times have been a little sloppy in their categorisation of survivors that they've sort of slipped into the category of survivorhood, and maybe with time they're less and less a feeling that they're not as much suitable to tell their stories as anybody else. So, going back to what I said about the testimonies, as a proportion of what there should be, there's a very small number, but at least we should be thankful that we have these. Thank you.